I've written this book that came out a few years ago called Reinventing Organizations that became this really sort of unexpected word of mouth phenomenon. But originally the book was written from a very personal question. I had engaged on a sort of a path of inner work, of inner transformation, a bit of a spiritual quest. And from that perspective, I realized like I could no longer work with sort of the traditional large corporate organizations. There was something in me that was just like, blah, like that is all so cold and soulless. And, at the time I was coaching senior executives, and when I would go into these organizations, it wasn't even mental, it was sort of visceral. Like I came into these headquarters with marble and glass, and it all seemed so incredibly cold, and everybody was running around and wondering about the next budget and the next 3-year midterm planning. And there's part of me that wanted to stop them and say, like, do you still believe in any of this? And so I realized that obviously I had moved on. Like, there are so many things in the way we do management that suddenly felt like it made no more sense to me.
Today, we're joined by the author of Reinventing Organizations, Frederic Laloux, who introduces the concepts and practices of a new generation of organizations that have made the leap to operate in a more soulful, purposeful, and productive way, thus allowing people to do productive and meaningful work, develop their talents and potential, and fulfill their calling.
And so pretty much from one day to the next, I decided I was going to stop working with these large organizations. But I realized this question of how do we get together as human beings at work? Like, how do we collaborate was still very dear to me. And I started researching and looking for organizations whose founders might have gone through a bit of the same journey that I had been through, and who might have left their large traditional organizations and founded something different that would be more in line with how they saw the world. And I stumbled upon a number of really extraordinary people who started some amazing for-profit nonprofits that were based just on an entirely different paradigm, an entirely different way of looking at the world. And what was fascinating in that research is that even though these people didn't know of each other and often thought that they were sort of the only crazy radicals that decided to run things really differently, what they ended up doing was often very, very similar, not only in principles, but really the actual practices. And it felt to me as if there was something new that was ready to be thought that different people were downloading at the same time. As if, we're just seeing the beginning of a new wave of ways of being together, of management. But it isn't just, doing a little bit of more of this or a little bit more of that, or let's bring a little bit of AI into HR, but it's really rethinking the very foundations of management. I thought at the time that this was sort of a very personal book, and that, it might reach a few tens or maybe hundreds of people who were ready for it. And what was interesting is just the enormous success that the book had, I think reveals the level of dissatisfaction and pain, and way more people than I imagined didn't need to be convinced that the current model is exhausted.
For some of us in different parts of the world, we don't really know how long, the social distancing will last, as well as the idea of, a new normal. For most of us, it's working from home. It's, creating some level of a reality that is somewhat normal, but not necessarily what has been. Do you feel as though the organizations and employees are going to be affected by this, and how do you feel that that's going to change?
I have a sense that this crisis is like most crises, that there's two very different forces that will play out, right? There's one force of regression, where faced with a crisis, we tend to become fearful, and we go back to old recipes that we believe will help us. And you see that happening in a lot of organizations that currently are trying to reinforce top-down control, like in terms of, when there's a crisis, the leadership should decide and everybody should obey. And then there's the opposite direction, which is breakthrough, which is like faced with something completely unprecedented. we have to invent our way out by going somewhere where we maybe would have wanted to go anyway, but now the opportunity is here. And so I think that people will have very, very different experiences, where for some people work will be even more meaningless or feel even more constraining, where the few things that you used to like about work, which was, sharing a cup of coffee with some of your colleagues and being able to gossip and get something off your chest, that is taken away from you because we're all at home. And then I see and hear from organizations where suddenly, managers are forced to trust people in their teams because they're dispersed. And suddenly you're switching to a whole different kind of trust-based management. And so I think we're going to see both of these things play out. What I'm really curious about is the longer term implications that few people are seeing. Like, as you're saying, like most people, when you read articles around what this time means, it means, okay, more working from home and more flexible hours and these kind of things. I can very easily imagine that trends that are already happening might really accelerate through this. But maybe it will take us a year or 2 or 5 to really see this materialize. But for instance, if you no longer have a manager who's looking over the shoulders of his or her people, right? But people are working at a distance and you can't really control them. In many ways, you're forced to start to trust people. You're forced to manage in a whole different way.
Yeah.
It won't take very long for some people to wonder, like, what do we actually need that manager for?
Sure.
Right? What is this manager actually doing, right? Other than, calling up people and checking if they're okay and then, putting some numbers in an Excel file and creating some PowerPoint slides, like, but, and so this trend that is already happening towards self-managing teams might very well be accelerated for good or bad reasons. Bad reasons being simply like, hey, we pay all these managers, we're not sure what they do, so let's just stop paying them. The good reason being like, wow, we noticed that people are actually much happier when they are self-directed. And, so that is one trend that I think is a major trend that people aren't very much talking about, but that I could see this pandemic accelerating. Another trend, like in the book I talk about it, is this notion of wholeness, right? That so many of us long to show up whole, like to finally drop this professional mask behind which we tend to hide so much of ourselves. But in most organizations, that feels like the safe thing to do. Like, I don't want to be seen with all of my personality and hopes and longings and quirks because it feels dangerous. Like, if people really get to know me, in many workplaces, that doesn't feel super safe. But I don't know if you've had the same impression, but we kind of let our guard down now on these Zoom calls, right? Like, you see my backgrounds and you see, and some of the things that we do start to feel a bit ridiculous, right? People talk about the Zoom shirt, right? So they have one Zoom shirt that they quickly put on, before the call, and then, they might be naked or they might be in boxer shorts below. Nobody knows, right? Like, but we want this appearance from here, right? And then we put on that. And
so there's been a whole lot of memes going on around with the gentleman with the top and no shorts on.
Right, exactly, right?
Online, yeah.
And when we dress up in the morning to go to, a place called work, that kind of, we rationalize that. But when we're in our own home and interior, like, there's something that just feels weird about this level of pretense. And it's interesting, right? If we think about it historically, the office is a very recent invention, right? For pretty much all of humanity, people worked in groups and, people worked from home. But this notion of this third place where we dress up in a certain way and pretend to be a certain person is really new, right? And this pandemic sort of allows us to see how unnatural that is. And so there's a hope that we will just accept to be much more of ourselves and accepting that of others. And that even if the offices reopen, that we won't quite go back to putting on this professional persona in the way that we had.
Do you feel as though proximity to others affects the ability of organizations to create relationships between peers and a sense of community amongst workers? So, how do you feel organizations can help make the new normal a productive space? With what you've just said around management, is management something that, in the near future going to be necessary? Productivity is something that obviously has shifted. Some people are finding them more productive. Some people are finding that they're completely demotivated.
The baseline from which I start is that most organizations, in the way they used to be, are or were incredibly unproductive. Like the gap between what could be if everybody was fired up, if everybody was able to bring in their talents, and then what is possible in most organizations is huge, right? And so for me, this question of the fact that we don't really see each other on Zoom or not on Zoom, and does that make us a little bit more productive, less productive? For me, that feels like we're talking about, a little bit more, a little bit less on something that was pretty terrible. And so the question for me is not so much, are we together or are we distant over Zoom, is what is the quality of our conversations? What is the possibility of our structures? Like if organizations on Zoom, right, switch to something where we have really deep and meaningful conversations in a team by simply asking each other, where are you at? Like, are you having fun? Like, do you feel like you can bring in the best of yourself? Like, what is it standing in the way? What should we change in your job description? What should we change in your scope so that you can bring the best? I could see working at a distance with Zoom being 10 times more productive than what we have today. Not because of the distance, simply because we're finally asking the right questions, right? We're finally doing the right things. And you see some of this happening in some organizations. There was a recent McKinsey article about, it was called, I think, Reinventing Your Organization for Speed. And it was just giving examples of, organizations that were planning to do something like curbside pickup, and they had a plan to do that, and it would take them 12 months to do it. And they did it in 2 days, right? Because they had to do these kind of things, right? You had to reinvent some of your factory processes much faster than you ever could. And it's interesting because what they write in this article is, how did that come about? Well, it's pretty much all the things that I write about in Reinventing Organizations. Is at some point, put all the people who know something about this in a room, give them power, accept that they can just decide without 5 layers of management deciding over what they do. Don't ask them to write any PowerPoint things, just allow them to do things, and suddenly within 2 days you can do something that would have taken you months to do.
Yeah.
And is that Zoom? Is that not Zoom? I don't really think that is the issue.
What do you feel would be the issue? Is it just letting people do their work essentially without the interruptions and the add-ons and the frills of either an institution or some sort of big scary manager? So do you think that could possibly be it?
One day I saw it sort of with an image. There is this self-managing organization in California called Sun Hydraulics. Not Sun Hydraulics, called Morningstar. And they're sort of the ketchup kings of the United States, right? They produce between 30 and 40% of all ketchup and diced tomatoes, and they're entirely self-managing, right? So they have no formal hierarchical structure. There's a lot of structure, like in all self-managing things. There's units and there's ways that people promise stuff to each other, and so there's lots of structure, but not a hierarchical structure. There's not a single manager in this company. And one day they mapped a sort of org chart, which is they simply mapped who is working with whom. Like everybody has 2, 3, 4, 5 colleagues, right, that they work most closely with on a daily basis. And they map this, and the result is just this sort of weird chart where you have like all these dots that represent people, and then lines that connect these people, and it's just this big sort of spider web. This is how work gets done. And it's so interesting to me because it doesn't look like an org chart at all. It looks like sort of a big spider web, right?
Yeah.
And this is what, you know, work looks in all organizations. It's people working with other people. But then on top of that, we sort of force an org chart that has pretty much nothing to do with the work.
Yeah.
But it's our little model of, okay, so here we have a team, and that team should have a boss, and then that boss should have a boss. And so that just becomes sort of this distorting second layer that we put on top of the first layer, and it makes everything more difficult. The problem is that we feel we need it, right? Because we have this notion that, hey, but if we don't have this, this is going to be chaos, right? This is going to be totally unproductive chaos. The truth is it's not chaos. Like when you work in a self-managing fashion, you have just as much structure. You have just as much clarity about who can make what decision. You have just as much clarity around, you know, do we make a budget or don't we make a budget? And you have just as much clarity around all of these basic questions of, you know, who makes, well, how much money at the end of the year? And so all of these questions that we have in traditional organizations, we know how to make them work in a self-managing fashion. It's just different. And it just takes away the second layer that distorts everything. And some organizations are suddenly finding out the power of this in times of crisis, because they empower these little teams to say like, okay, do something about curbside delivery. The risk is, of course, that most of these organizations, when the crisis subsides, I think will want to go back to the good old hierarchy, unless they've really understood, you know, what was actually the power of what happened there.
You know, for a lot of organizations, and I've seen it not only with myself, just I'm thinking around my life, you know, because I'm quite an early adopter as far as things like technology and ways of working and that kind of thing are involved. But I think when it comes to things like my own personal life, like I enjoy traveling, so I assume that I'll just go back to traveling, for instance, you know, and I'll go back to living life as it were. I believe that organizations are possibly also seeing this in a similar light, and not obviously all organizations, but your organizations that are maybe bigger in terms of them being corporates, or they, you know, quite more, their culture is quite stringent and a little bit stricter. What would you say to those organizations as far as, you know, going back to normal and having people, you know, they believe you have to see people in order to convince yourself they're doing work. You know, you have to, you know, there's the hierarchical approach is one of the best ways of working. What would you say to organizations, or to people leading those types of organizations, around a way of thinking that can work for the future?
I would just ask them, like, if you want to go back to normal, how good was normal?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question.
Like, most organizations, if they run engagement surveys, find that, you know, people aren't very engaged. Like, people aren't very happy in work. If you ask most organizations, like, are you satisfied with whatever is important to you, right? Most leaders I know behind closed doors will tell you, like, I don't know how to motivate my people anymore. You know, things are too slow. Like, people are not innovative, and I don't. Yeah, most of them will admit that things weren't working very well. So I think the realization that might be triggering new possibilities is, I'm going back to normal because it's the only thing I know.
Yes.
But actually, if I think about it, normal wasn't very attractive to me. It certainly wasn't very attractive to my people, quote unquote, like, you know, most of them being not super motivated by work. But it wasn't even working for me at the top. And this is a conversation I try to have with corporate leaders, is get them, and it's sometimes, you know, you need to have that conversation really behind closed doors, because it's very hard for them to admit. But most of them aren't having fun. Like, they got to the top of the ladder, you know, something that they've worked for years. And if they stop for a moment and think about it, they have to admit to themselves that this is not what they were hoping it would be.
Yeah.
Right? That they're hopelessly overworked, that they feel pretty lonely, that the power difference, the hierarchical difference, poisons all of their relationships. Right? I often think about powerful people, big corporate leaders, a little bit like children from billionaires, right, who never know if any of their friendships are real.
Sure.
Right? Do people like me because of me, or do they like me because of my money? Right? And people at the top of organizations have the same thing. Like, do people are people nice with me because of me or because of where I stand? When people say yes to me, like, yes, this is a great idea, do they actually mean it? Or so being at the top of these organizations that are run in a traditional way isn't actually very fun. And so it's a system where nobody seems to be having fun, like not people at the bottom of the organizations, not middle managers, and people at the top will always pretend like they do because that's what they want to project. But if you ask them in private, they will also admit that this isn't what they were hoping it would be. And so do we really want to go back to that normal? And I never try to convince people of these new models because I don't believe that you can be convinced into them. Like, these ways of operating are so different, like they require a different perspective, a different worldview, and it's not something you can convince somebody rationally about. But I think the really interesting question is getting people in touch with how much the old system wasn't working and how much pain there is in the old system, including for themselves.
And that being said, what will young professionals and career starters have to take into consideration, both personally and professionally, before joining a company in the future?
It all depends on your level of choice, obviously. Like especially in the beginning of your career, often, you still want to prove yourself and you want to have a big name on your CV. And so you join an organization that might not necessarily be fun or the best, and you might not even know what questions to ask. But I think especially for young people who are just joining this, I would ask the question of the broader purpose, right? I feel that we're all in this weird tension that is not our own fault, but it's just the times we're born into, where a lot of us are deeply concerned around the environmental breakdown, around the climate emergency. And we go into these organizations where this is not a topic, where this can't be talked about, or only very superficially with some sort of, whatever green program or greenwashing program there is. And for many of us, that is a terrible tension, right? There's parts of ourselves, parts of what we really care about that we shut down because it becomes too painful. And so we participate in systems that are often deeply destructive, right? And so we get offered a job at Coca-Cola and whatever, in marketing in Coca-Cola, and it sounds really cool. Until we stop and we go like, wait a minute, like, Coca-Cola, like, what is that? It's one of the most destructive companies in the world in terms of health, right? In terms of what it does with waters, in terms of the plastic bottles, in terms of, do I really want to be part of that system? And so it's an invitation I have for all of us, but in particular, young people we talk about digital natives. I think, the younger generation they're climate natives. Like, they've been brought up with the fact that we are in this crisis in a way that I haven't, like in my mid-40s. Like, and so, yeah, what system do you really want to participate in? And I know that it's a big, scary question because the systems are so broken. And so if we decide not to play in those systems, like, which are the companies that we actually could join? There are not that many of them that really deserve our respect in that field. So it's a big question. But I'm hopeful. Like, I think, again, like, this coronavirus crisis to me feels like such an opportunity.
Sure.
I wouldn't be surprised that we're this close to an awakening inside companies around our purpose. And I'm not talking about this mission statement purpose, this beautiful slogans that we all have, but that don't mean very much. But of a real awakening where massive numbers of people inside organizations will say, hey, I really want to question what our organization does. I don't want to participate in this anymore. Like I only participate if we take really meaningful steps, if we become a circular company, right? If we meaningfully, slash any fossil fuels that we use, if we completely recycle. And again, I feel like the pandemic has been really interesting in that way, in revealing how much of our work is lacking purpose. I don't know if it's maybe an experience you might have had, but if you live with somebody, right? If you live with a loved one, or if you live with roommates or something, and they overhear, your Zoom meetings, and overhear how meaningless a lot of these meetings are.
Yeah.
How much there is no purpose seemingly in what we do. It becomes very hard to hide that to our friends and to our loved ones. Like, when we go to a separate place, and okay, there I'm a sort of a different person, and I work on stuff that doesn't make very much sense. It looks important, and I go home, right?
Yeah.
But suddenly now people see, like, wow, that sounded like a really horrible meeting. Like, what was that about? Right? It just takes, the blinders off that we wear, and it forces us to ask, like, what is this job that I'm doing? Like, is it contributing in any meaningful way? And beyond my own job, like, is my company even contributing in any meaningful way?
No, that's quite a meaningful and profound, response to what I've asked. One of the challenges that I think you picked up already from your answers before is just how working from home, or the institutions that we are placed in, that being taken away has had us as people have to do a lot of internal work and a lot of sort of reflection around who are we, what are we doing, is this something that means something to me, is this really where I want to be, do I recognize who I am in this role, or am I just, because prior to this, for a lot of people, I'm sure our participants will agree, you were just going to work and it became part of your routine. You didn't really have to question much because, you're going with, in Johannesburg, here in South Africa, we call it the rat race, the big city rat race. You wake up in the morning, sit in traffic, go to your job. It's just part of your routine. So I think this is a really, really great way to unpack some of the things that we've just previously, I think, just adhered to because it was just the norm, So I think this pandemic has really helped in that. With the gig economy and freelancing rising and contract jobs have now become more common. And I think organizations recruiting independent workers on short-term contracts is rising. How does this sort of impact the nature of organizations? And how do you feel professionals can adjust to the modern world?
I'm in two minds about this. There's part of me that feels like we're touching the gig workers is sort of the low-cost version of something that is really interesting, which is that we are no longer feeling like we belong to one organization. We no longer merge our identity with one organization, right? For decades, people who joined organizations, once you joined an organization, that was the place you were going to retire, right? And you became part of that organization, and that was sort of your identity, and you lost yourself a little bit in that, right? I know that I worked for years at a consulting firm at McKinsey, and it's an amazing organization at making people lose their sense of identity and becoming sort of, who they are in their work. And that happens in a lot of organizations. And in a lot of ways, being sort of a gig worker, being on your own, forces you to have some of these questions that we just talked about, like, what is it that I really want to do? And, what do I want to stand for? And what's the purpose that is noble for me? Now, of course, a lot of these gig jobs pay very, very poorly, right? And aren't necessarily soul fulfilling. So there's the promise there, but the way our systems operate right now by paying so extraordinarily poorly, some of the people who are essential workers, right? And we finally in the crisis saw how important that work actually was. Don't allow to fulfill the promise of this thing of, I'm actually here on my own, and where am I going to bring my work in? in a way that is most meaningful. So it feels like to me like there's something promising there, but it's still the old model that is pushed to the extreme, right? The old model has always been there's clear boundaries, and there's some people that we have in the organization that we have to treat more or less well, right? So that they are more or less productive. And then there's stuff that we can outsource, and then we call it not part of our organizations. And there we can just squeeze everything out of people, right? And so we're going to squeeze out, cleaning services, and we're going to squeeze out production to factories far away, right? And we're going to squeeze out farm work, and we're going to squeeze out, right? And suddenly we're not bound by our own moral code. We can just really go for the cheapest exploitative practices because, hey, we're just contracting with other organizations and we don't really know what they're doing, right? And the gig work is still part of that. It's simply like, oh, they're not on our books, they're exploiting themselves now. So yeah, we're not really responsible for that. So I feel it's the beginning of something really promising, but it's still in the old structure that are really exploitative. And I have no crystal ball of where this is going to lead us, but I feel that ultimately the spirit of this is something that more and more of us are going to embody, which is this question of not simply where is my paycheck going to come from, but what is work that feels meaningful to me? What is mine to do? What is the contribution that I can bring in these crazy times? What are the skills that I need to use on a daily basis so that I feel good about myself, so that I flourish? And, if I look at that, who are the organizations that I want to work with? And so that freedom that's embedded in gig work is something that I wish, we can all benefit from.
There's a word that you used, freedom. So I assume that a lot of people that get into the gig space are pursuing to a certain extent some level of freedom that they don't feel that they can get from organizations. So I think that is something that maybe, and I think that obviously it lacks with organizations exploiting people that are freelancers, etc., having them on short-term contracts and just ending them willy-nilly without necessarily a great explanation. So I don't think, and I think you're quite realistic in your response. Some of us can be quite optimistic to the extent that you're being naive around certain things. So it's great that you brought it up that with the freelance and the gigging type of work, it does become quite difficult. What is your opinion about companies which sell alcohol? How would you approach working with them towards a more conscious model?
I want to broaden it from alcohol in general, because I feel that we're defining what is destructive too narrowly, right? We have our obvious villains, right? It's alcohol. Yes. Right, it's arms sales, right, and so we have our villains, right, and people say, fund managers should not invest in cigarettes and arms and alcohol, and as if then all the rest was okay. And I think we have more soul searching to do. And a few months ago, I came up with this sort of little framework. I was wondering, like, what organizations actually deserve to exist, and what organizations actually, when would the world be better without them? And I came up with 3 questions, and to me, these 3 questions feel really, really powerful, and they stayed with me. So I want to share them with you, if I remember them. So the first question I had was, what would happen to your organization, to their sales, if advertising and marketing wasn't allowed?
Yeah.
Right? Say you're Coca-Cola, right? And your sales depend on the fact that you have to pump in billions of dollars every year to create a demand that otherwise wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Right? What does that say about your product? Like, does the world really need your product if it wouldn't sell, if there was no artificial creation of demand? The second question is, what would happen to your product if consumers had to see a little video of 5 minutes of how your product is made or how your service is made, right? If people saw, how Coca-Cola is made, and Coca-Cola is not the worst thing, but like how people who work on sugar plantations are exploited, right? How
Mm.
mind-numbing jobs are in factories where Coca-Cola is bottled, and some of these things. Would people still buy your product? Third question is, what would happen to your product if the sales price reflected all of the costs to society of your product, right?
Sure.
If Coca-Cola had to pay for all of the healthcare cost of childhood obesity, right? Had to pay for the early deaths that its product helps create. If Coca-Cola had to actually pay for the price of all the water that it depletes, if Coca-Cola had to pay to fish out every single bottle in the middle of the ocean or somewhere deep in the forest, like, I don't know what a bottle of Coca-Cola would cost, but I imagine that instead of being whatever, $1, it would be $10 or $20. Like, how much of it would you actually sell? And these questions, like, they haven't left me. If advertising wasn't allowed, if people actually had to see how you make your products, and if you had to pay the full cost, paying everybody a decent living wage, and right, I imagine that the sales of Coca-Cola would go from 100% to, I don't know, maybe 2%, 5%. There would be some hardcore who couldn't do without, but everybody else would go like, no, like at this cost and with what I know now, without advertising. So does the world actually need Coca-Cola? I'm just picking up on Coca-Cola, but it's true for so many of the companies we work with. And so I think that's the kind of soul searching that I think is necessary. And so alcohol, could be sort of an obvious villain. And I think a lot of the things that we participate in belong in the same sort of category, where we go like, would the world actually be better off without us? Or only half of us, or maybe just a quarter of us? That to me feels like a very worthwhile question to ask.
So old sort of traditional organizations are going to be forced to reinvent themselves. Is it possible to trigger and build this movement of change on organizations? Or do you feel that this is something that might be quite hard to achieve, considering even, this current pandemic as well?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. I have a sense that, as always, we're going to see a mixture of some old system at some point that it will crumble and will be disrupted by new organizations, right? In my book, there's this example of Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, this, home care organization that just out of nowhere displaced all of the existing organizations because they were just so much better. And then you'll have large organizations who transform from within. Like, I'm positively surprised in the last few years that I've met a number of CEOs of really large organizations who get this and who want this now. It's really hard to change such a large organization, but they have their heart and their mind in the right place, and they really get this and they really want this. And I was surprised to see CEOs of large organizations be there, but we're going to see, I think, more and more of this. The pandemic is helpful. Like, a lot of senior leaders are very fearful, like all of us. Like, we're social animals. We're fearful of what others think if we behave differently from everyone else. Like, if we stand out, and so there are leaders who clearly behind closed doors will tell you that the current system is broken, but they don't dare to really stand out and to innovate too radically, because if ever it fails, like what will that mean for me? And the pandemic has sort of broken that, and I think has given permission to innovate much more. And so I see this as an encouragement. And so if you are, one of these leaders listening to this, use the pandemic as an excuse to innovate and say, oh yeah, we need to do things differently.
Do you believe, with what you've just said around, there are quite a number of executives and CEOs who would like transformation or some level of transition, but might be a little bit scared because, you don't always necessarily want to be the first to do it and potentially fail. But there is also the element of, with change in organizations, it doesn't necessarily have to always come from the top. Do you believe that it's possible for change in an organization to come from elsewhere?
The experience shows that people, say middle managers or people at the bottom of organizations, can sometimes do surprising things in their own bubble, for a while. But unfortunately, it rarely, or I've never seen an example where that thing ends up affecting the whole organization unless the CEO is ready, right? That's just the power of our pyramid, is there's so much power at the top that unless the very top understands this and wants this, that this is going to stay sort of a local experiment. But still, it has a huge amount of value. Like, you learn a lot, people in there learn a lot, other people get attracted to it and go like, oh, I wish we could do the same as you, and why can't the whole organization be like this? So it prepares minds for this, even if it doesn't end up transforming the whole organization. You ask, how do we push CEOs for the transition? I don't like the word push very much, because it means that we have an agenda onto them, and as soon as we do that, they sense it. And they will get into resist mode, right? If anybody tries to push something onto me, I will start resisting. So the best thing I've learned to do is to invite them into a reflection of how is normal working for you, right? We talked a little bit about this for your organization, right? And the easiest thing typically for them is to admit that everything is too slow and people are not motivated, and we're not innovative enough, and it's so hard to attract good talent and all of these things. And then ask them why that might be so. And then ask them very personally, like, are you actually having fun in this? Like, is this what you've been working so hard for years to achieve? And often that, I find, is a very meaningful conversation. So I've noticed that for people to move into something, it's not because they're convinced by any idea. It's because deep down, there's something in them that says, like, I just don't want to continue in the way it is. Like, they have to have reached that point where they go, you know what, I don't care, but it has to be different. And there's a number of conversations that I think we can help them with or invite them to. One of them is then the conversation of, okay, so if this isn't working for you, what do you truly care about? What is truly important in your life? And those are often very beautiful conversations where people reconnect with something that is really, really important. Often very deeply personal conversations, right? I don't know, like, my parents always told me I was stupid, and I wanted to prove that I wasn't, that I could do amazing things. And actually, what is really important for me is that everybody in this organization can really be at their best. Actually, you know what? Now that I talked about, like, this is, and then suddenly they become passionate about something. And so it's grounded in a principle where then they're willing to experiment and to let go with something. And so having these really profound conversations about what matters to them, what is the most important, is I think really interesting. Another conversation that I'm having, which I think is really interesting, is what is your plan B?
Yeah.
Imagine that you're grounded now in something that's really important for you, and you're willing to reinvent things and to do things differently, even if it looks risky. The reality is very often it's absolutely not risky, right? Like, people make things happen, like your productivity will go through the roof, but it might feel risky. Imagine worst case, like, this doesn't work out. People think that you're a crazy leader and they kick you out. What is your plan B? What is something else you could do in your life that would be as interesting and meaningful as what you do now? And I've asked this question to a number of CEOs. Actually, the first time I asked it was with a group of 15 Brazilian CEOs, no joke. And none of the 15 had a plan B. It was really interesting to me. And so we had this profound conversation where they actually admitted to the fact that if they were kicked out of their role as CEOs, it would feel like an ego death to them. It would feel like their world would fall apart. Like, they wouldn't know who they are if they're not a powerful CEO. It had become so much part of their identity. And so we realized that if you have no plan B, if it feels like an ego death, if you get kicked out of your current position, then by definition, you are actually powerless. And they all admitted to it. Like, we look like we're very powerful, but we're actually powerless. We're powerless to act on what is most important to us. We came to this conclusion: you're really powerful within a very small box of conventional ways of doing things. And anything that feels really important to you that would require that you do things differently, you're actually powerless because you're so scared. And it was a really uncomfortable, but also liberating conversation where they said, yeah, that's true. Like, we're scared like shit to do things different. And that triggered antibodies. Now, I haven't followed up with them, but it felt like it triggered antibodies. Like, they don't like to see themselves that way. And so then the question becomes, okay, so what is the plan B? Imagine you get kicked out. What else could you do with your life that would be as meaningful? Maybe I'll work for a foundation that works with, people in underprivileged neighborhoods. Maybe I work in things that work on the climate. Maybe I actually have enough money and I can spend time with my family. Maybe I start my own little business with my brother-in-law, and it's not huge, but it's fun.
We have a question from a group of Frederic Laloux enthusiasts from Brazil. Frederic, we're right now in this call 14 plus people who have translated your book in Brazil. The pandemic has brought so many opportunities and vocabulary for us to further expand the future of work. As a group of activists, what are your insights about our collective work as a movement? What more can we do to take advantage of this moment?
Wow, I wish I had an answer to that question. Let me think. What comes up for me is this thing. I think we can have a role in shining a light on how bad normal was. Right? We've talked about this before, right? There's an amazing article from George Monbiot. He's a journalist I love. He writes in The Guardian, and one of the most recent articles was about this: politicians promising to go back to normal. And he just shows survey after survey of how people actually don't want to go back to normal. Like, there was an understanding that our systems were broken. I think we can highlight that. And I can share one way I personally have tried to highlight that in a number of conversations that I've had. At some point, it struck me that, we human beings are the COVID of the living world, right? COVID, we think, roughly kills 1% of the people that it infects, right? Maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, we don't know exactly. And I realized that we human beings kill 1% of everything we touch, but not once like COVID, but every year, right? If you look at all of the numbers, it's around 1%. Like, we've, 50% of all mammals have disappeared in the last 40 years. It's a bit more than 1%, right? 70% of all the insects in Europe and the United States have disappeared in the last 30 years. That's a little bit more than 2%. 50% of all the tropical forests have disappeared in a bit more than 100 years or something. That's a bit less than 1%. Coral reefs and mangroves and, everything is disappearing roughly at a rate of 1% a year. And that just gives me chills. Like, I'm emotional right now talking about, like, we freaking kill 1% of everything we touch every year. And it's going on. Like, we're just like the COVID of the natural world, right? Except that there's no vaccine right now. That there's no social distancing. The world cannot social distance from us. Like, it's, and suddenly I see normal in this way. It's shifted my perception of normal. In some ways I knew all of this, but just phrasing it that way, right? And obviously, like, very often we've already killed 100%. Like, there's thousands of species that disappear every year that's never going to come back. Like, they're the 1% to 1%, we've reached 100%. So is that the normal that we want to go back to? So I think we have a role to play in there, in whatever feels important to you personally. Like, what is the normal that you don't want to go back to? For me right now, a lot of it has to do with how we kill everything around us. But maybe for you, it's how mind-numbing work has become, how demotivating work has become, or how work is grossly unfair to people from people with lower levels of education, or peoples of color, or people with, from lower social classes. Maybe that's the thing where you go like, suddenly the crisis has shown us that, we live in these grossly unfair societies. I'm from Belgium, but I now live in the United States, and it's really interesting to notice here in the United States how, after the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement has really opened up the eyes of so many people. And I think this is the opportunity that this crisis presents, for the climate crisis, for the stark inequality in our societies, for whatever you're passionate about. I think our role can be to highlight that. And then the flip side of that is, what is the possibility behind that, right? And certainly when it comes to organizations, we now have enough to show about how well these things work, that we don't only need to show how bad things are and we don't want to go back to normal. We actually have something very easy to show, like, it can be so much better.
That's definitely something that, we could all learn from this pandemic. It's been a bit of a pause button on what we know to be normal. And I guess to an extent, it's really has had many people reflect, especially for people who have potentially lost their jobs or some level of income, or people who, and not necessarily meaning that this has now pushed them into a different type of, pushed them in some sort of level of desperation. They might have been able to maintain their lifestyle, but now have to find an identity outside of, what they thought they were, as well as obviously, people who've either struggled or felt really great around the changes in their day-to-day lives. And I think that's all we'll have time for today, Frederic. Today has been such an amazing session, and thank you so much for taking time out and joining us. Al, would you like to leave us with any information of how anyone may be able to get in touch with you, as well as any work that you might have coming up that might be interesting to us or to the people that might be listening on the podcast?
Yeah, maybe just point people to the fact that next to the original version of the book, which is this thick thing, I've created a shorter illustrated version, which is available in many languages. And it's a much easier way, like if you're interested in this and you don't necessarily want to read a 380-page book, there's an illustrated version that you might find interesting. And then last year I did a video series. It's 130 videos, which is the equivalent of a whole new book, that's specifically around the question of, if you are in a large traditional existing organization and you want to move towards this new paradigm, what do we know about what works and what doesn't work? What do we know about pitfalls? What do we know about, and everything I've learned since the book came out, I put them in these video series, and they're freely accessible on the website of the book. So if you go to reinventingorganizations.com, you'll find a link to that video series called Insights for the Journey.